have your Bibles, we're going to the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles in each of the pews, and they'll go along with what I'm reading here this morning quite well. But we also have these particular verses on the overhead. Exodus chapter 20, beginning at verse 18. The Bible says, "And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said unto Moses," well, I think we've stopped with the 21 there. Okay. Let's pray together if we could. Brother Dexter, would you lead us?
Most gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you once more this morning, just praising you, Father, and just thanking you for all the many blessings and what you've done for us within our lives, Father. We just can't thank you enough. I just pray that each and every one will just look back in remembrance of what you've done for us. I know so many times you do things for us, Father, and we just forget. But we need to search our hearts and go back to the things that you've done in remembrance of what you've done for us, Father. So, Father, I just ask that you give Brother Wayne, we should go over this lesson here, his word, Father, that you just give him the word you have us to hear, and take it in within our hearts. Father, just help us to use that into the word. Father, we give you all the glory and praise for each and every thing that you said. For without you, we're nothing. And with you, we can do all things. And I thank you so much for that. And the freedom in this country. I just pray that we keep our freedom, Father. And don't let us lose it. We just ask that you be the leaders of the country, Father, and watch over us. Help us to turn back to you. In Jesus' precious holy name we pray.
Amen. I thought it was kind of interesting as I was studying and preparing and looking through the things that I was going to talk about this morning. When I got into the Sunday school lesson, it talked about a whole lot of the same kinds of things. When it talked about God, and it talked about the thunderings and the lightnings and some of those things that had to do with that. My message title is When God Speaks, and actually the full title, I guess, would be When God Speaks to a Nation in some sense of the word. I remember years ago, one of the movies that was on television was a movie that had to do with the next voice you hear, and it talked about listening for God. I think probably one of the things that's wrong with that particular movie is the fact that God has already spoken and that he speaks through his word. The Bible tells us plainly that in the last days, in these last days, that God has spoken by his Son. That's the word that was made flesh. But, every year, about this particular time in the year, as I'm going through and looking at different things, I go through and pull up a PDF file of the Declaration of Independence. And I go through it where it speaks about when in the course of human events. And then I go and get the Constitution and I read all the way through it. You can read every bit of them in just a few minutes. There's not a whole lot there. Okay, you can see what it speaks about and what it says. Even going through all, I think there's 23 amendments. You can go through every one of them, including the Constitution, and look at those things. But when we look back at at that, and I'll just talk about it for a minute before I actually get into these verses of Scripture the way that I want to. If you look back at the choices that our forefathers made, that those that were involved in writing that Declaration of Independence, and those that were involved giving their lives, giving their property, giving their finances, giving everything that they had to help to bring about freedom to a nation. There's a great deal of things that we look at and we think about it, that freedom has its price, and liberty is not automatic with declaring it. There was a number of years past that point in time where liberty actually came, where freedom actually came, where we actually became a nation, and more years even than that before the Constitution was actually put together and ratified, and everything with all the states and everything that was there. But those things that we listen to, they're words that we cling to. We treasure freedom, we sing about liberty, but freedom is God-given. Freedom actually comes from Him. In our verses that we're looking at today, we are at Mount Sinai. Last week, as we looked at chapter 19, we recognized that we had just arrived there 3 months following the time that they had gotten, a little more than 3 months perhaps, but between 3 and 4 months when they had gotten, when they left out of Egypt. And so we recognized a number of things that have to do with that. We realized that as God was speaking to them, He told them, He warned them, He kept them from coming up too close to the edge. And although, as we look at these verses, somebody says they probably wouldn't have got very close anyway because it scared the daylights out of them. They were frightened of the things that were occurring and the things that were happening, and the thunders and the lightnings and all of those that we look at when we come to these particular things. Now, when we get to this particular chapter, there's an awfully lot to cover, and I'm actually probably going a different way than you would think that I would as we begin to look at this today, because I want to look at the commandments just a little bit more as we go over in that particular direction. So I'm not going to be actually talking a great deal about them today. What I want to look at is the latter part of the chapter, which actually coincides with chapter 19. And the things that it dealt with in that chapter it's dealing with in the latter part of this particular chapter in a lot of ways. And so it follows God speaking where everyone in the congregation could hear, where the voice of God came out, where they listened themselves as God told them not only who He is, but what those commandments were. He went through what we normally call the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, the things that, and often we are able to quote, or different ones, whether they can quote them in order or not. They recognize those 10 Commandments, and we generally recognize them when we hear someone else repeat them, or when someone else says them. We see them in a number of locations. They're actually those 10 Commandments are actually on the door of the Supreme Court. Those 10 Commandments are around in different places, even in government buildings, although they oftentimes talk about pulling them down and doing one thing or another in some of those kinds of ways. But they are there. But we really like to think about those things that deal with hearing the voice of God and hearing Him speak in a way. But the reality is that that same God that we're talking about, that same one that spoke to Israel, that same one that was leading and guiding them when the cloud by day and the fire by night, the same one we're talking about is here with us in this room. Amen. God hears and God sees and God knows and God recognizes who we are, and He knows what's in our hearts and in our lives and what it is that we long for and desire. Now, what we saw last week as we were looking at things that had to do with chapter 19, we recognized that God's grace had been with them all the way through it. It was God's grace that led them out. It was God's grace that brought them through the water of the Red Sea. It was God's grace that gave them the sweet water at the place where it was bitter. It was God's grace that gave them manna every morning to eat. It was God's grace that gave them the quail to eat. It was God's grace that gave them the water in the place where all the wells were. It was God's grace that had brought them from where they had been in bondage, where they had been in slavery, where they had been unable to do the things that all free men desire and long and want to do, to the place where they were at this particular point in time. It was that's what it was. And as they come here to this particular place, then God gives them the law. Now, you know, as you study these, a lot of times different people talk about the law and the grace thing, and they see them as contrasting, and they see them as almost opposed to one another in some sense of the word. And the reality is, we know that we are saved by grace. Does that mean that we are not to obey these laws that God gives? Well, I think every one of us here sitting here know that it's still wrong to steal and to kill and to bear false witness, and it's still wrong to commit adultery. It's still wrong to covet anything that belongs to our neighbor. It's still wrong when we do not honor our father and our mother. And it's particularly in any sense of the word that you want to talk about it, it is a necessary thing that we recognize who God is and what God has done for us, and all the things that relate to that. Indeed, when we go through what often they talk about as the first commandment, and they read a number of those things, I think it's a very significant thing that God begins by saying, I'm the one that brought you out. I'm the one that made you free. I'm the one that gave you this liberty. I am the one that did all of these things for you. And He begins by saying those things. And as we look at our own life, and we look at where we come from, and we look at our background, we recognize that He is the one that has brought us out, that He is the one that has given us freedom, that He is the one that has made us able as a result of what Jesus did on the cross of Calvary. Now, I want you to recognize something when you begin to look at some of these verses and some of the things that it begins to say in these. We sometimes use a whole sentence to say one word that Israel had in their dictionary or their definition or whatever it happens to be. One word that they had. Sometimes it takes us a sentence to explain whatever it is that it's talking about. And the word reality is for Israel, as they began to say here to Moses, and they began to talk to him about the circumstances that surrounded what had just taken place, because as God spoke to them, they scared the daylights out of them, and they began to back away from where the mountain was. They didn't even want to be close to the fence. They didn't want to be close to anything they wanted, and they said, "Don't let God talk to us. You talk to us." Now, God had actually told Moses in the 19th chapter, the words that had just been previous to this. He said, he said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to, as I speak, they will come to know that you speak for me, that the words that you are saying come from me, and they will recognize that. And it's not exactly those words, but those are the things that He told Moses about this. And as And so God, as He spoke to them, they were frightened of it. They were frightened of the thunderings. They were frightened of the lightnings. They were frightened of all the things that were taking place in that. But that word to hear, He said, we will hear, is what they speak down with us, and we will hear. But the word hear actually means, in the Hebrew, it goes beyond that. It's hear and obey. It's the same thing. It means the same thing. To hear means to obey, and that's a very significant thing, you see, because the reality is that oftentimes the words go in and the words go out, but they don't stay. They don't stick around. They don't become a part of our life. They don't become who we are. And that's true of whatever kind of situation we have to be in, whether we're listening to our spouse or we're listening to somebody else or whatever. Sometimes with the words don't register somehow. You hear the words, but they don't register. But the reality is, when we begin to look at these things, to listen to God means it means obey. It means not just listen. It means when you hear what He says, to do what He says. It means to recognize that He has that authority and that right to give you directions, to tell you what it is that you're to do and how you're to live and all of those things. That we're talking about our Creator here, and that's a very significant thing. Now, when we began to look at some of these things that we're talking about, and we began to look in the Old Testament Scripture, there's some very very interesting things that you tend to see about these particular things. There is a viewpoint that often people have of God, and the way that they tend to see, and the way that they tend to think about things. Billy Graham, several years ago, actually the first book I ever had of Billy Graham's, I was just a teenager, and my pastor gave it to me. It was called Peace with God. It's been around a very long time. I don't know if you've ever read that book or not, but he in the fourth chapter of that, he began to talk about some things that people began to see, and that was a long time ago, and these things that he was talking about were around, and they were here then. As he said, people tend to say if God is a righteous and loving being, then why is there so much wickedness? Why is there so much suffering? Why is there so much sorrow? How did all this hatred come to be? How did we begin to worship at the shrines of greed and self-interest and war? And how did the human race, which God made in His own image, sink to so deep into depravity that the Ten Commandments had to be set forth with the demand that they be kept? Why are all these things the way they are, and how come they're that way? He told a story that was told by Dr. Scott about a young man that had come home, and he had just been away to school. He was learning all those things at the university, doing those kinds of things, and so he came home and he looked at his dad, and he says, "Now that I've been to university, I'm no longer sure I can go along with your simple childlike faith in the Bible." His daddy just sat there for a little while and looked at him, and then he finally said, "Son, that is your freedom, your terrible freedom." You see, when we began to look and recognize, and we go in through the Bible, we recognize that, all of those pictures often that people see of cave dwellers and all those kinds of things, that isn't where it all began. You see, it began with a man named Adam. And God made Adam in a different kind of way. He made Adam with freedom. He made Adam with the ability to choose. He made Adam with free will. And the reality is that, here's the thing. When we began to think about those things, we recognize that for freedom to occur, there has to be more than one path. There has to be more than one direction. There has to be more than one possibility. You see, if there's only one possibility, if there's only one thing you can do, then there isn't any freedom there. You have to do what it is. But God gave freedom. Freedom implies the right to choose, to select, to determine one's action. And so that was the test. And that was the moment when Adam could use his free will to choose the right path or the wrong path. Choose it because he wanted to, and not because there was only one path open to him. And Adam made his choice, and he suffered the consequences for it. Here's what Billy Graham said about it. He said, "God is not to blame for the tragic snarl in which the world has so long found itself. The fault lies squarely with Adam. Adam, who was given his choice and who chose to listen to the lies of the tempter rather than to the truth of God. The history of the human race from that day to this has been a story of man's futile effort to gain back the position that was lost by Adam's fall, and failing that, to reverse the curse. But this is unfair, somebody says. Why should we suffer today? Just because the first man sinned way back in the farthest reaches of time. Why hasn't mankind recovered during the intervening years? Why should we go on being punished every day of our lives? There is a current thought, he said, that it is possible to improve man by improving his environment. Isn't it strange to recognize that the first sin was committed in the perfect environment? Now, when we look at these things, we recognize that freedom is certainly a treasure, but it does mean having a choice. I want you to see something in these verses, and I'm going to hurry up along this line. But he says in verse 21, "And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near under the thick darkness where God was." Now, to me, that's a really, really interesting word. You see, because in history, there have been a lot of dark times. There were dark times in the Middle Ages. There were dark times when the world wars were. There were dark times when Babylon and many of them, after they had taken the Jews captive, when they were one thing or another, where they was trying to destroy them. There were dark times during the times of Israel when the kings did not serve and did not trust, and where they led Israel astray. There were dark times in a lot of those places. But the picture I get as I look at this particular verse is very significant. I think however we see the time in which we live, however we think about it in any way, God is in the darkness. He's not far away. He's close by. And whatever the circumstances are, He doesn't leave us in the midst of difficulties. He doesn't leave us in those situations. We recognize those very significant things. Somebody said it this way. I've forgotten what his name is, but he said we scale it down to a more narrow focus, more intimate and individual, and we come to the darkness of human experience. We could talk about the darkness from the perspective of the devastating trials that occasionally strike us in natural evils such as whatever takes place, like a tornado or a hurricane, an earthquake. There are other ways to talk about it, more personal: failure in business, loss of health, a shattered romance, divorce, desolation, bereavement that comes because of the death of a loved one. And in the midst of that kind of darkness, we often stand afar off from God. We cry helplessly, or we unleash emotional anger. We tremble at that kind of darkness. But the thing is that in the midst of it, God is still there.
Amen.
And that's the thing, you see. In the midst of all of what was taking place, God spoke to them out of the thick darkness. He spoke to them in the midst of every situation, and He still does that with us today. God responds to us in the critical times of our life, in the difficult times, in those moments. I read a poem, and I don't know that I've got through everything I really wanted to say here this morning, but I want you to hear this. It's called "Your Terrible Freedom," and which I was actually looking for that quote that I found that Billy Graham said when I found this, because I remember reading it years ago, and I came across this poem. I thought it was kind of neat. It says, "A bold experiment began when God created earth and man, giving man the power of choice to spurn His word or heed His voice. That day the angels held their breath as man chose sin, self, and death. God could have saved this world its woe by building robots that would go in just the paths that He had designed, obeying but obeying blind. He could have saved his son the shame by forcing man his will to claim. But God's bold test was for a cause, to prove through man though man may break his laws, and nail his Savior to a cross, that God will triumph over loss, and bring himself eternal fame by cleansing man from sin and shame. For only ransomed souls can sing, no praises flow from robot things, and heaven's angels now rejoice to think that God gave man a choice. We look back, and oftentimes we say different things about when we look at Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, and all that took place there. 25 years ago, I made a trash can. I'm still using it. I made it to be a trash can. It's been a trash can for 25 years. It has no will of its own. It's only capable of being what I made it to be. Choice doesn't enter the picture, except on my part, for I'm its maker. I can dispose of it, rip it apart, burn it with fire. I can destroy it, I can take away its usefulness, or I can use it for what I designed it to be, but it has no choice. The objects we create, what separates us from them, what separates us from what we make, is the fact that God made us and gave us a choice. He gave you a choice. He lets you decide whether you trust Him or don't. He lets you decide whether you follow Him or not. He made the laws that we find in the Word of God. He made the 10 Commandments. He gave them Himself. He spoke them out. He wrote them Himself with His finger on the tablets of stone. Twice He did that. Because the first set was broken and it came down off the mountain, and the people were worshiping the false god that was there. But we make the decision to follow or not to follow. And in that decision lies eternity. Whether you go to heaven or whether you go to hell, that's where it's at. And it's your decision, because He's given you the right to make it. What decision will you make? Father, in the name of Jesus, Lord, I do pray that you reach down right now and touch, and Lord, just meet the needs here. There's one that's lost. There's one that doesn't know absolutely for certain and sure that heaven is their destination, that they have a home on earth. Lord, I pray that today they make that decision for you. They would trust you, follow you completely. And Lord, to hear what your word says is indeed to obey it, to follow you, to do what it is that you give us to do. In Jesus' name we pray.